The prairie stretched out in every direction, a sea of gold and dust beneath a sky bruised with fading light. The wind whistled low, stirring brittle grass and carrying the faint scent of smoke from some distant fire. Out here, time felt like it had stopped, like the land itself had grown tired of watching men kill each other. A lone rider moved across that empty horizon, slouched in the saddle, his hat tugged low against the sun's last glare. His horse was lean, ribs showing beneath a coat streaked with sweat, but carried him steady, 1 mile after another. The rider's name was Farraday, though he did not think of himself that way anymore. He thought of himself as what the land thought of him, a shadow, a ghost that refused to stay buried. By the time he reached the town, the light was nearly gone. The place lay quiet, too quiet for any settlement that size. The main street cut to the middle like a scar, lined with buildings that sagged under the weight of silence. Windows were shuttered, doors barred, lanterns dimmed. The few souls who dared to linger outside slipped into alleys when they saw the rider approach. Only the saloon kept its lights burning, spilling smoke and fiddle music into the night. Farraday tied off his horse at the hitch rail, patted its neck, and stepped through the swinging doors. Inside, the saloon was a haze of cheap whiskey and cigar smoke. A half-dozen men hunched over a table near the bar, their laughter sharp and mean, the kind that belonged to those who had never learned to laugh without cruelty. Their boots were dusty, their coats trimmed with the shine of brass buttons and revolver grips. Farraday recognized the type: scouts, hired killers, men paid to choke a town into silence. His eyes lingered on them for only a breath before drifting to bar, where a glass of whiskey waited for a coin. He paid, sipped, and let the burn spread across his tongue. The men at the table took notice. One of them, broad in the shoulders with scars slicing across his jaw, leaned back and looked Farraday up and down. "Stranger," he drawled, voice thick with challenge. "Don't reckon I've seen your face round here." Farraday didn't look at him. Most reckoned right. The room quieted a notch. The piano stopped playing. The man's chair scraped back against the floor, heavy boots stomping closer. Farraday kept his eyes on the mirror behind the bar, watching the reflection of the man drawn near. He could see the others at the table shifting, hands brushing close to pistols. "Best be careful how you talk," the man said, close now, the smell of sour whiskey on his breath. Farraday set down his glass with deliberate calm. His hand hovered near the deck of cards scattered on the bar. He plucked one, a joker, bent at the corner, and turned it over between his fingers. His smile was thin, practiced. "Careful's all I am," he said, and in one fluid motion, he flicked the card into the man's face. Startled, the man swore, jerking back. In that heartbeat, Faraday's revolver was out, cocked, the barrel steady on the man's chest. The saloon drew its breath and held it. "You gonna draw?" Farraday asked softly, voice almost kind. The man froze. His hand twitched, then stilled. Behind him, the others watched with sharp eyes, but none moved. Faraday's gaze cut through them one by one before he slid the pistol back into its holster. "Didn't think so." The saloon let out its breath all at once. The piano started again, tentative notes filling the silence. The man backed off, muttering, dragging his pride back to the table. Farraday lifted his glass and finished the whiskey. He was about to leave when a hand touched his arm, light, hesitant. He turned. A townsman stood there, hat in hand, eyes hollow with desperation. His clothes were plain, worn thin from labor. "Sir," the man said quietly, glancing toward the table of hired guns. "You don't know us, and we don't know you, but we need help. They work for Bogue, the one who owns this town now. He takes what he wants, land, gold, lives. And there ain't nobody strong enough to stop him." Farraday studied the man, seeing the tremor in his hands, the way his jaw clenched to keep it steady. He thought of how many faces like this he'd seen before, how many pleas he'd turned away. Yet something in the man's voice lingered, an echo of something Farraday had long tried to bury. "You want me to fight your war?" Farraday asked. The man's eyes flicked toward the table of killers, then back to him. "Not just you. There's others. Men who'll stand if someone leads them. They say you're fast. They say you don't scare easy." Farraday almost laughed, but the sound died before it reached his lips. He was fast. Yes, he had killed more men than he cared to count. But he scared easy every night, in dreams that left him gasping. The faces of the dead pressed close against his eyelids. "I'm no savior," he muttered. "No," the man said softly. "But maybe you're the only chance we got." For a long moment, Farraday said nothing. He weighed the weight of silence, of walking away like he always did, leaving the world to burn without him. But something in the man's plea gnawed at him, a truth he could not shake. He had lived long enough as a shadow. Perhaps it was time to stand in the light, even if it burned. Outside, the night stretched endless, stars cold and distant above the prairie. Farraday mounted his horse, the townsman's plea echoing in his ears. He rode out of town, the saloon's music fading behind him, replaced by the steady thump of hooves. He did not ride far before others joined him, figures slipping from the darkness, drawn by the same whisper of rebellion. A sharpshooter with eyes sharp as a hawk's, a tracker who moved like a wolf through brush, a knife fighter with silence stitched into his every step. Each carried their own sins, their own ghosts, but all shared one thing, the will to fight back. They rode together until dawn painted the sky in fire. The town still slept behind them, caught between hope and despair, but on the horizon, 7 riders cast long shadows across the earth. Farraday glanced at them, then at the rising sun. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of purpose pressing against his chest. He touched the brim of his hat, muttered a quiet vow to no one but himself, and spurred his horse forward. The war was coming, whether he wanted it or not. Dawn broke cold, a pale light spilling across the plains as the 7 rode back into the heart of town. Their horses stamped tired hooves against hard ground, snorting steam into the morning air. Windows cracked open to watch them pass, cautious eyes following with equal parts hope and fear. Farraday felt the weight of those stairs pressing against his back like stones, each gaze a plea he wasn't sure he could answer. By the time they dismounted, the main street was stirring. Men and women stood outside with shovels, hammers, and whatever tools their hands could find. Farmers with weathered faces, carpenters with cracked knuckles, even children clutching rifles too large for their shoulders. They looked at Farraday as if expecting him to conjure salvation with a wave of his hand. He gave them nothing but silence, letting his eyes drift to the others who had chosen to ride at his side. The sharpshooter, tall and lean, adjusted the scope on his battered rifle, his eyes restless, always searching the horizon as if every shadow might hide an enemy. The tracker, with hair like tangled brush and scars across his arms, crouched low, running his hands through the dirt as though the land itself whispered secrets to him. The knife fighter, quiet and wiry, sharpened steel with patient strokes, the sound of metal on stone steady as a heartbeat. Each man carried an aura of violence worn like second skin, yet beneath it, Farraday saw the same hollow hunger, the need to be more than what their sins had made of them. They set to work at once. The tracker led farmers into surrounding fields, pointing out high ground, choke points, and cover where ambushers might hide. The sharpshooter climbed the church steeple, lining sight down Main Street, mapping fields of fire. The knife fighter walked silently among the townsfolk, teaching them where to strike, how to hold steady, how to stand firm when fear clawed at their stomachs. Farraday found himself walking the line between them all, his words sparing but steady, reminding them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to face it anyway. By midday, the town bore the look of a fortress in the making. Barricades rose from wagon wheels and broken lumber, sandbags stacked along porches, rifles loaded and placed where they could do the most damage. Sweat and dust clung to every face, but behind the exhaustion flickered a spark, a fragile, growing belief that they might just endure what was coming. That night, firelight danced against walls as the 7 and the townsfolk gathered in the square. Laughter rose in uneven bursts, brittle and sharp, but it was laughter all the same. A fiddle player coaxed a tune from broken strings. Children clapped along, and for a fleeting moment the town remembered what it was to be alive without chains tightening around their throats. Farraday sat apart from the circle, a bottle resting against his knee, the flames painting his face in shifting shades of gold and shadow. His smile was faint, hollow around the edges, but his eyes burned with the weight of memory. A woman approached, one of the townsfolk, her hair tied back, hands rough from labor. She sat across from him without asking, her gaze steady, unflinching. "You fight like a man who owes a debt," she said softly. Farraday met her eyes, his own rimmed with the ghosts of 100 nights. "I fight like a man who knows it's too late to pay." She studied him for a moment, then nodded as if she understood. Sometimes one good deed can balance a lifetime. The words struck deeper than he let her see. He looked away, back into the fire, where sparks leapt upward only to vanish against the night. The moment broke with the sound of gunfire. Sharp, sudden, and close. Shouts erupted from the barricades as riders swept in from the dark, scouts of the outlaw baron, testing the town's defenses. The 7 moved as one, instinct rising like an old wound. The sharpshooter called out from the steeple, his rifle cracking, each shot finding its mark with deadly precision. The tracker guided men through the alleys, flanking the attackers with brutal efficiency. The knife fighter moved like a phantom, slipping through the chaos, steel flashing in the dark. Farraday himself strode into the storm, revolvers drawn, the smile gone from his lips, every shot ringing with finality that left no room for hesitation. The clash was quick, violent, a storm that tore through the night and left silence in its wake. Smoke clung to the streets, the metallic stench of blood hanging heavy. One of the townsfolk lay dead in the dust, his face pale, eyes staring wide into nothing. Farraday knelt beside him, pressing a hand against the man's chest as if he could will the breath back into him. But death was stubborn, unyielding. Farraday let his hand fall, his jaw tight, his heart heavier than before. The townsfolk gathered, their grief raw, their fears sharper now than ever. Children clutched mothers, men stared at their bloodied hands, wondering if this was only the beginning. Farraday rose, dust clinging to his coat, his voice steady but low. "This is the price," he said. "It won't be the last. But if we turn back now, all of this, all of him, was for nothing. Stand or kneel forever. The choice is yours." No one spoke, but in the silence, in the way they lifted their chins, in the way their eyes hardened against the dark, he saw their choice made. Later, when the fires dimmed and the streets grew quiet again, the 7 stood together at the edge of town. The tracker smoked in silence. The sharpshooter cleaned his rifle with meticulous care. The knife fighter sat cross-legged, his blades laid out before him like ritual. Farraday stood apart, watching as the townsfolk built a pyre for the fallen. Flames licked high into the night, sparks rising to vanish into the stars. The man's body burned, the smoke trailing upward like a prayer too heavy for words. Farraday whispered into the night, his voice cracked and nearly lost beneath the wind. "We burn so others can live." The others heard, though none spoke. They stood in silence, shadows against the fire, each of them carrying their own unspoken burdens. And though the pyre burned bright, lighting the night like a beacon, they all knew it was only the first of many. The flames roared, the townsfolk wept, and Farraday turned his eyes to the horizon, where the dark pressed close and heavy. Somewhere out there, the Baron was gathering his storm. The night held its breath, waiting. The dawn came heavy with silence, thick as gunpowder smoke before the matches struck. Men lined the barricades, eyes red from sleepless hours, hands trembling against rifle stocks. The air itself felt brittle, as though the earth knew what storm would break upon it. Farraday stood in the middle of the street, watching the horizon. He had learned long ago that battles announce themselves in small ways, quivers in the ground, shifts in the wind, the stillness of birds fleeing before death. And now he felt it again, creeping under his skin. The first sound was distant thunder. Hooves, hundreds of them, pounding the earth until dust rose like a wall against the rising sun. The outlaw baron had come, not with whispers or scouts, but with the roar of an army. Men rode at his side, rifles gleaming, banners snapping in the morning wind. They came like locusts, hungry, merciless, stretching across the plain until the town looked like an island against an ocean of death. The sharpshooter's voice broke the stillness. "They're here." His scope glinted in the light, one eye narrowed, the other cold and steady. The tracker crouched low at the barricade, muttering the count of riders like a prayer. The knife fighter tied his blades against his forearms, his silence sharper than any steel. Farraday rolled his shoulders, felt the revolvers resting against his hips, and told himself that if he was to die, it would not be running. The first wave hit like fire on dry grass. Riders surged through the dust, bullets tearing through wooden fences, glass shattering from windows. The townsfolk answered with ragged volleys, rifles jerking in uncertain hands. Smoke swallowed the street, screams cutting through the din. The sharpshooter's rifle cracked, each shot finding its mark with deadly precision. A rider pitched from his saddle. Another spun backward with blood spraying into the air. The tracker moved like a shadow, slipping between barricades, guiding men into crossfire where the enemy stumbled into sudden death. The knife fighters struck from the alleys, blades flashing. Riders pulled screaming from horses into the dust. Farraday moved through it all like a man caught in a storm of his own making. His revolver sang. Every shot thundered in his ears, his body moving before his mind could reckon with the killing. For a moment he forgot guilt, forgot regret. There was only the clarity of survival, the brutal rhythm of steel and blood. The first wave broke. Bodies lay strewn in the dust, horses screaming, the air thick with powder smoke. The townsfolk cheered, some raising rifles in trembling triumph. But the tracker shook his head, his face grim. "That was the hand they wanted us to see," he said. The real storm still coming. They had little time to prepare. The second wave came with fire. Barrels of pitch rolled into the streets. Torches flung against rooftops. Flames climbed fast, licking skyward, painting smoke black against the morning sun. Heat pressed against skin, sweat stinging eyes. The townsfolk scrambled to save what they could. Buckets of water dashed against fire, but the blaze spread like anger, devouring walls and timbers. In the chaos, courage showed its teeth. One of the seven, the broad-shouldered brawler, threw himself against a wagon loaded with powder kegs. Shouting for the others to fall back, he lit the fuse with steady hands. The explosion ripped through the street, taking a dozen riders with it, the shockwave knocking men to their knees. When the smoke cleared, only fire remained where it stood. The townsfolk's cheers turned to cries of grief, yet they fought harder now, spurred by a sacrifice. The sharpshooter's rifle cracked faster, anger sharpening his focus. The tracker led counterstrikes through alleys, turning the town itself into a weapon. The knife fighter's blades dripped red, his face unreadable as ever, though his silence carried weight heavier than words. Farraday felt the loss more than he admitted. The brawler's laugh had been the loudest by the fire, his courage the most reckless, his heart the most loyal. Now there was only smoke where he had been. Farraday clenched his teeth and fought harder. Each shot a vow, each kill an answer to the debt he carried. The battle dragged on, hours stretched thin by fire and blood. The townsfolk fell one by one, their bodies carried from barricades only to be replaced by others with the same hollow fear in their eyes. By noon, the street was a graveyard of broken wagons, shattered glass, and scorched wood. Yet still the riders came. Then the Baron himself appeared. He rode a black horse taller than the rest, armored with steel plates strapped to its chest. His coat was long, black as midnight, dust swirling around him as though the world bent to his presence. His face was pale, carved from stone, his eyes as cold as a winter river. He did not shout, did not brandish his weapon with fury. He rode calm, almost regal, the certainty of victory etched into every line of his being. Behind him, more men followed, disciplined and relentless. The battlefield stilled at his arrival. Even the flames seemed to quiet, smoke curling upward in reverent silence. Farraday stood in the center of the street, bloodied, sweat-streaked, his revolvers empty. Their eyes met across the smoke. Two men bound not by fate, but by choice. The choice to take, the choice to stand, the choice to kill for what they believed mattered. The Baron raised one hand. His men halted. The silence pressed down on the town until it felt suffocating. Then he smiled, a thin, cruel smile, and pointed at Farraday. "Bring me the jester," he said, his voice carrying clear across the distance. Farraday felt the weight of it, the taunt wrapped around his name. He had been called a trickster, a gambler, a man who laughed at death. But in that moment, there was no laughter left in him, only resolve, sharp and cold as steel. The riders surged again, gunfire tearing through the fragile silence. Farraday dove for cover, loading bullets with trembling fingers, his ears ringing with the roar of battle. The sharpshooter shouted warnings in the steeple. The tracker guided men through collapsing barricades. The knife fighter struck like lightning in the smoke. But all of it felt like a prelude to the inevitable. The Baron waiting, watching, patient as death itself. By the time the sun dipped low, the town was broken. Houses burned to ash. The church steeple cracked and listing. The street littered with bodies. The 7 had held, but barely, their numbers thinning, their strength bled dry. The townsfolk wept over the fallen, burying fathers, sons, and brothers in hurried graves. Farraday stood in the ruins, revolver heavy in his hand, staring across the smoke-filled street. The Baron sat tall on his horse, untouched. His men fanned out behind him. Their eyes met again, and this time neither looked away. The wind shifted, carrying the stench of smoke and blood. For a long moment, the world narrowed to 2 figures standing in a town-turned-graveyard. Farraday knew the battle was not over. It had only sharpened to its true edge. The duel was coming. The night bled into dawn, and with it came silence, deep and heavy. The smoke had thinned, leaving the town in ruin, blackened beams, bodies half buried in ash, streets littered with the detritus of war. What little remained of the townsfolk clung to each other, hollow-eyed, clutching rifles with hands that shook from exhaustion more than fear. The 7 were no longer 7. Only a handful stood now, each marked by blood and fire, their shadows stretching long against the broken earth. Farraday moved among them, his gait stiff, his face pale with wounds that bled to the torn edges of his coat. Yet his eyes burned clear, sharpened to a single point, the man who had not yet fallen. The Baron sat astride his black horse at the far end of the street, waiting. His men fanned out behind him. But their numbers had dwindled too, thinned by the relentless defense. Still, he radiated certainty, as if the land itself would bend to his will. Farraday could feel it pressing against him, that aura of inevitability. It might have broken another man. It might have made him turn, ride, vanish into the horizon. But Farraday no longer had the weight of escape in him. He had run enough. The sharpshooter crouched in the ruins of the steeple, one eye on his scope, blood running from a wound at his temple. "I can take him," he whispered. But Farraday shook his head. "This ain't your bullet," he said. His voice carried quiet finality, a tone that silenced argument. The others looked at him. The tracker with dirt-streaked hands, the knife fighter whose blades dripped crimson, the townsfolk who leaned on barricades that would not hold another charge. They knew, as he did, that it would end in the street, between 2 men. Farraday stepped forward. His boots crunched in the dust, the sound louder than gunfire in the deadened air. He adjusted his hat, rolled his shoulders, and let his hands hang loose at his sides. The Baron dismounted, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He unbuckled his coat, revealing the gleam of silver pistols at his belt, then walked into the open, his shadow falling long in the morning light. The town seemed to vanish around them. No voices, no flames, only the stretch of dirt street and the space between 2 men. Faraday's heart drummed, but his hands were steady, his breath even. He remembered every man he had killed, every night he had drowned in whiskey and regret, every face that had stared at him from the dark. For the first time, those ghosts did not weigh him down. They stood behind him, silent witnesses, waiting to see if he would finally lay them to rest. The Baron's lips curled in a smile that did not reach his eyes. The jester thinks he can stand against a king. Farraday almost smiled back. "I've played my share of kings." None of them laughed long. The Baron's eyes narrowed. The street tightened, time stretching thin as glass. Dust swirled, horses stamped, a board creaked in the wind. And then, in a heartbeat, both men moved. The world slowed. Faraday's hand blurred toward his revolver, the Baron's pistols flashing silver. The crack of gunfire split the silence, echoing down the street. With splintered, sparks jumped from stone. Farraday felt the burn of lead tearing through his side, the hot sting blooming across his ribs. Still he pressed forward, his revolver steady, his eyes locked on the man before him. The Baron fired again, bullets screaming past, one grazing Faraday's shoulder, another tearing his coat. Pain surged, but Farraday did not falter. He had one trick left, one card hidden up his sleeve. In his left hand, hidden until now, was a second revolver, lighter, faster, meant for the final move. He drew it in a blur, his body twisting even as blood poured from his wounds. The Baron's eyes widened, surprise breaking through his mask of certainty, as Faraday's bullet found its mark. The impact knocked him back, his pistol slipping from his grasp, his body folding into the dust. The street rang with silence once more. Faraday staggered, breath ragged, vision swimming. He stood over the fallen man, watching as the Baron's chest rose and fell shallow, his eyes clouded with disbelief. The king had fallen, and the jester had dealt the card. But Farraday knew the cost. His knees buckled, his revolver slipping from his hands. He fell into the dirt beside the man he had killed, the weight of his body too heavy to hold upright. The townsfolk rushed forward, voices calling his name. Hands tried to lift him, but he waved them off with the last of his strength. "Don't," he whispered. "Let me be." The woman who had spoken to him by the fire knelt at his side, her hands trembling as they pressed against his wounds. Her eyes filled with tears, but he shook his head faintly. "One good deed," he murmured, the words barely shaping themselves on his lips. "One good deed to balance the rest." She leaned close, as if to catch the final breath of his voice. "You gave more than one." A faint smile touched his face, softer than any expression he had worn in years. His eyes closed, his chest rose once, then fell still. The street held its silence, broken only by the soft weeping of the townsfolk. The sharpshooter lowered his rifle. The tracker bowed his head. The knife fighter stood motionless, his blades hanging loose at his sides. One by one, the people knelt in the dust, not in defeat but in respect. When the sun finally rose high, the smoke cleared enough to show the town in its ruin. Yet there was life stirring still. Children stepping from hiding places, men and women lifting beams, carrying water, beginning the work of rebuilding. The Baron's men had scattered. They were broken, their leader gone. The town, battered and scarred, had survived. They buried Farraday on a hill overlooking the plains, his grave marked by a wooden cross hammered into soil. The wind swept dust across the marker, carrying it into the endless horizon. The townsfolk stood in silence, hats in hand, their faces lit by the rising sun. The sharpshooter placed a single bullet at the foot of the grave. The tracker laid down a strip of leather cut from his own boots. The knife fighter drove one blade into the earth, leaving it to stand upright, steel catching the morning light. Their tribute spoke louder than words. The woman who had knelt at his side lingered last. She touched the cross, her eyes steady. "You'll be remembered," she said softly, "not as a jester, not as a ghost, as the man who stood when no one else would." The wind caught her words, carrying them out across the prairie. The camera of the mine pulled back then, climbing into the sky, showing the town scarred alive, the graves of the fallen marked against the earth, the horizon stretching endless beyond. The story did not end. It carried forward, in every nail driven, every wall raised, every child who would grow up free of chains. And on the hill, where the dust curled and the grass bent low, the grave of Faraday stood, the sun gleaming against its cross as if to say the land itself had taken its burden and laid it to rest.